In a packed Washington, D.C. studio, Karoline Leavitt publicly mocks Jasmine Crockett, sneering that she's just a diversity pick in a suit. The audience laughs until a man in the third row slowly stands. A war-scarred veteran, her father, and the room goes ice cold. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't have to. In a matter of seconds, a political takedown turns into a national gut punch about race, sacrifice, and the brutal weight of silence. What did America finally see in that moment, and why has no one been able to forget it since? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. Inside Studio 4B of Voices of America, the air was tight, electrified. A live audience of 300 sat beneath cold lights, every lens rolling for a national broadcast. On the main screen, the night's question pulsed in bold white. Is America too sensitive about race and politics? It wasn't a question, it was bait. The room wasn't built for comfort, it was built for confrontation. Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage like a verdict already written. Red blazer, practiced smirk, eyes sharp with strategy. She didn't hesitate. She didn't soften. She took her seat with the confidence of someone used to applause before the sentence was even finished. Her charm was a weapon, polished, market-tested, and ready to draw blood. She wasn't here to debate. She was here to dominate. Then Jasmine Crockett walked in. No smile, no nod, just purpose. Clad in black, silver cross resting against her collarbone, she moved like still water, controlled, composed, watchful. She didn't scan the crowd. She didn't look for approval. She sat without performance, without apology. The host cleared his throat. Tonight, he said, we ask whether identity politics is dividing America or finally giving it voice. But the real question hung unspoken. What happens when the room realizes one guest came to talk, and the other came with something far heavier, truth and a witness to carry it? The lights never flickered, but something colder crept into the studio. Just as Karoline parted her lips with the kind of smile that doesn't warm a room, only sharpens it. I think America's had enough of symbolic politics, she said, her tone polished, her delivery effortless, like someone repeating a line she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror too many times to count. We need real leaders, people chosen for their work ethic, not their skin tone. The words glided across the studio floor like oil over glass, smooth, shiny, and deeply flammable. She didn't look at Jasmine when she said it. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew who the comment was aimed at. And Karoline? She sat back slightly as if proud she'd said what others were too polite or too afraid to voice. It wasn't an outburst. It was a controlled burn, the kind that doesn't leave ashes right away, but leaves something much worse, a lingering silence. A ripple of laughter rose from the audience. Not full-throated, not joyous, but the kind of laugh that comes from people who feel protected by power, who believe cruelty becomes wisdom if you say it calmly enough. A few clapped. Others glanced around to see if they should. The host, sitting 3 feet from Jasmine, gave a neutral smile and moved his thumb to the next cue card. No challenge, no redirect, no acknowledgement that the line had crossed a line. Because in that room, the wound wasn't visible, not yet. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. Her shoulders remained square, her chin level. No sigh, no scoff, no counterattack. She'd learned a long time ago that some rooms didn't deserve her anger. That silence, when wielded right, cuts deeper than noise. But her silence wasn't passive. It held. It stretched. It filled the space Karoline thought she had claimed. And still, Jasmine's eyes didn't shift toward her. Instead, they stared just past the lens of the camera, as if she saw something the audience hadn't caught yet. That's when the camera turned. Just a beat. Not planned, not signaled. Just a slow pan across the third row. A man sat there barely moving, dressed in a gray military dress coat worn soft at the shoulders. His hands were clasped over one knee, his back straight, his jaw still. On his chest, a faded bronze star and a U.S. Army insignia, dulled not from neglect, but from years of use. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just looked, straight ahead, toward the woman who had just suggested his daughter didn't earn her seat. His silence wasn't hesitant. It was deliberate. The silence of someone who had held dying soldiers in his arms and now had to sit here and watch his child be dressed down with a sentence wrapped in civility. The camera cut away, too quickly, but the image had already landed. That man wasn't a guest. He wasn't on the run of show. But for those few seconds, he became the gravity of the room. He was the contradiction Karoline hadn't calculated, the part of the story she thought would stay silent. He had bled for a flag that now sat behind her on LED screens, and he had raised a daughter who'd made it into rooms like this only to be told, on live television, that her presence was decorative. Jasmine still said nothing, but her father's stillness spoke in a language only a few in that audience understood, the language of war, of restraint, of deep generational injustice worn quietly like a uniform. And as the tension climbed, not with shouting, but with stillness, even the laughter in the back row faded. Because something had shifted, something real had entered the room, and it did not laugh back. The silence should have settled the room, but Karoline wasn't interested in quiet. She wanted a reaction, and she was willing to cut deep to get it. She shifted in her chair, leaned in with casual confidence, and delivered the next line as if tossing out a clever aside over wine, not on live national television. "You know," she said, voice light but blade sharp, "I spent years in politics without needing to wear a victim's badge just to get invited to the table." There was no stumble, no hesitation. It was said like a fact, like something reasonable. But it wasn't. It was an accusation disguised as experience, and Karoline knew it. Every syllable was aimed with precision. It didn't need to be shouted to be cruel. It just had to sound calm enough for people to pretend it wasn't. She paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. Sour, heavy, intentional. Then she turned her head toward Jasmine, her eyes locked in like a challenge. "Just a joke, of course," she added almost sweetly. "I'm sure you're strong enough to take a little joke, right?" The room didn't laugh this time. Not fully. A few low chuckles floated from the back rows, then died quickly. A sense of discomfort crept across the audience. But no one spoke. No one interrupted. No one stopped the clock. And the host, still seated between them, flipped his cue card as if he hadn't heard what everyone else just had. That was the cruelty of it. It was allowed. Because it came wrapped in irony. Because it didn't break the rules. It bent them just enough to make others complicit. Jasmine didn't move. Her posture held. Her expression didn't shift. No sigh, no eye roll, no rebuttal. But inside her chest, something tightened. Not from pain, she'd felt worse, but from recognition. This was familiar. She had heard variations of this line since her first town hall, her first courtroom, her first classroom. Each version said the same thing. "You're only here because someone needed you to be." And each time she had stayed steady, because that's what survival looked like in rooms built to test how much you could endure without breaking. But behind her, something subtle shifted. Her father, seated just off camera, leaned forward a fraction of an inch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was immediate. His fingers, once relaxed across his thigh, closed slowly into a fist. His gaze, which had been still, now narrowed with the sharp clarity of a man who had learned to measure threats, not by volume, but by intention. The insult hadn't been thrown at him, but it might as well have been, because what Karoline had just said, with a smirk and a shrug, didn't just challenge his daughter's right to speak. It mocked the cost of everything it took for her to get there. He had worn a uniform in foreign deserts, led men through mortar fire, buried comrades under flags. He'd stood for a country that hadn't always stood for him. And now here he was, in the third row of a television studio, watching a woman in red tell his daughter, on air, in front of millions, that her voice was only valid if it could survive ridicule, that her strength wasn't earned, it was expected. And if she didn't laugh along, she'd be seen as weak, emotional, proving the very point they accused her of. Still, he didn't rise, he didn't interrupt, but his silence changed. It became heavier, more intentional, a tension that rolled off him like pressure from a sealed chamber. Anyone watching closely would have seen it, the small, precise movement of his clenched jaw, the steady breath pulled through his nose, the kind of restraint that comes from a lifetime of being forced to carry composure like armor. because he knew, more than anyone else in that room, that the real danger wasn't in what had been said, but in how easily it had been accepted. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch, because she understood the game. She'd seen it before. The insult delivered with a smile, the silence from the crowd, the test of endurance dressed up as debate. But that didn't make it right. It didn't make it easier. And as she sat there, still, composed, unshaken, she wasn't just holding her own dignity. She was holding his. She was holding theirs. Because there is no medal for grace under fire. No applause for not reacting. But in that moment, her silence was its own kind of strength. A strength built from generations who had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to give them the performance they want. The line between performance and reality had shattered, and now what hung in the air wasn't tension, but reckoning. The studio, moments earlier alive with artificial charm and engineered laughter, had turned still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for permission. Something had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The claps had faded, the smirks had stiffened. Even the crew behind the cameras had paused their routine movements, eyes narrowing behind the glass of the control booth. For the first time all evening, the power in the room wasn't coming from the stage. It was pressing in on it. Karoline sat upright, her expression fixed, but something in her body language betrayed the smallest ripple of awareness. Her punchline hadn't landed. It had detonated in a way she hadn't prepared for. The host cleared his throat, but his voice came out thinner than before. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, the words more careful now. "Would you like to respond?" It was meant to be a segue, simple, clean, but it came out like a challenge, like he'd just handed her a live wire and waited to see if she'd flinch. All eyes turned to her, the cameras, the lights, the weight of the room itself. Jasmine didn't speak right away. Instead, she did something so subtle it carried more power than any monologue. She lifted her right hand, the same hand that had been holding her pen the entire time, and placed the pen gently on the glass tabletop. Not dropped, not slammed, placed, with care, with control. Then she exhaled once, slow and deliberate, like she was releasing not just breath, but heat, pressure she had absorbed without permission. And then for the first time that evening, she turned her head, not toward the host, not toward Karoline, but toward the third row. Her eyes found him instantly, as if she'd known he'd be waiting. Her father, still seated in that same upright position, the gray in his beard catching the stage light, the service pin on his chest barely visible now beneath the studio glare. He didn't move when she looked at him, didn't nod, didn't smile. He just looked back, calmly, directly, his gaze carrying more than paternal support. It carried history, carried battles he had never spoken of in public, carried pride tempered by pain, an expectation born from survival. Jasmine held his eyes for only a second, but it was long enough for her to draw something from him. Not instruction, not permission, grounding. And then she gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, yet deliberate. It wasn't a signal of agreement, it was a declaration. I know exactly where I am, and I am ready. He didn't nod back. He didn't need to. Instead, he adjusted nothing, except his gaze, which now slid slowly and without hesitation to Karoline. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't theatrical, but it was unavoidable. The kind of look a soldier gives when he's seen a threat not worth shouting about, but too dangerous to ignore. His hands remained calm on his knees, but one finger flexed. A subtle motion, involuntary, like muscle memory kicking in from a time when he'd had to hold steady while everything around him demanded a reaction. That was the tension now, not between Jasmine and Karoline, but between a father who had bled for a country and a woman who just questioned the legitimacy of the person he had raised. Karoline looked away, only for a moment, but it was enough, because in that instant, the performative energy she'd carried all night, sharp, smiling, rehearsed, collapsed under something heavier. Not because anyone shouted her down, but because the one man in the room who hadn't said a single word had just spoken more truth through stillness than she had with all her carefully chosen lines. And Jasmine? She hadn't said a thing yet. But the room now belonged to her. The room didn't breathe. It waited. And in that stillness, Jasmine chose not to retaliate, but to reveal. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her voice came low, firm, and unhurried, like a verdict being read aloud for the first time in years. "That man," she said, turning her head just enough to gesture without raising her hand, "is my father." The words cut clean through the stillness. Lieutenant Colonel Isaiah Crockett, U.S. Army, retired. A few heads turned in the audience. Others followed her line of sight. He was still sitting in the third row, in the same position he had held the entire night. Back straight, hands on his lap, eyes forward, calm as stone under pressure. "He served for 26 years, Jasmine continued, led 3 combat tours, decorated for valor, and on his final deployment, he was shot in the chest while rescuing wounded soldiers during a ground ambush in Kandahar." The studio didn't move. You could hear the shift in breathing patterns. People no longer reacting, but absorbing. "He was the one who kept the unit alive," she said. "All 27 men made it home. They survived because he refused to retreat." Her voice remained steady, but the undertone changed. It wasn't pride. It wasn't pain. It was something colder. Memory. "But do you know what he came home to?" Jasmine paused just for a second. "An investigation." The word landed hard. "Because someone claimed he'd given preferential protection to the black soldiers in his unit." Her eyes scanned the studio once, not defiantly, but factually, like a prosecutor laying out an exhibit. There was no proof. There was no violation. But that didn't stop the rumors, didn't stop the threats. It didn't stop someone anonymous to call him, in a letter mailed to our home, a disgrace to the uniform and a black traitor hiding in camouflage. The room tightened. The cameras didn't move. Not yet. They were locked in now, held by something larger than news. Jasmine inhaled slowly, keeping her tone contained. "He fought for a country that let someone write that about him, and no one investigated that." A long pause, then, deliberately, "But tonight he sat quietly and watched a woman suggest that I don't belong here, because someone thought I looked right on paper." Now she turned her body just slightly toward Karoline, not for confrontation, but clarity. "So let me be very clear. He didn't carry a gun through enemy territory, so I could be told I'm a diversity trophy in a red-lit studio." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He didn't bury friends under American flags, so my worth could be reduced to a checkbox in someone else's culture war." Karoline didn't answer. She couldn't. The smugness on her face had drained into something vacant. Her hands remained folded, but they had lost their energy. Her mouth stayed shut. Not out of strategy, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound grotesque under the weight of what had just been spoken. For the first time all night, she looked, not at Jasmine, but downward, toward the table, toward her own reflection in the glass. And then the camera shifted, slowly, silently. As if drawn by gravity itself, it moved to the third row. It found him. Lieutenant Colonel Crockett. He hadn't moved. Still upright, still composed, but now in full focus. A close-up that filled the screen not with flash or drama, but dignity. His jaw was square, his shoulders held with quiet authority. But it was his eyes that told the story. Eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by political theater. Eyes that had once scanned the sand for snipers, and now scanned a studio full of people pretending to be brave. He didn't frown. He didn't cry. He just watched, calm, patient. But beneath that calm was the unbearable weight of recognition, that even after all the uniforms, all the sacrifices, he still had to watch his daughter defend her legitimacy in a room that thought her strength was optional. The camera stayed on him, and it stayed, because there was something about that stillness that the audience, both in the room and across the country, could no longer look away from. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't demanding justice. He wasn't even reacting. He was proving everything, without speaking a word. And suddenly Karoline's entire argument, crafted, rehearsed, delivered with polished ease, began to look like scaffolding built over a fault line. It had held for 10 minutes. But now, with nothing more than Jasmine's voice and her father's silence, it began to collapse in real time. And no one, not the host, not the crowd, not even Karoline herself, could stop it. Karoline inhaled sharply, preparing to speak, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to minimize the damage. But she never got the chance. He stood, no warning, no shift of attention, no words to clear a path. Just a slow, deliberate motion, his palms pressing gently against the tops of his thighs as he rose, inch by inch, like a man who had been sitting not out of weakness, but out of discipline. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flash, no rustling of clothes, no sudden gasp. But somehow the motion carried more force than anything said on that stage all night. 1 second, he was seated like a forgotten name in the credits of someone else's story. The next, he was standing like a verdict had just been delivered, his shoulders squared as if he were still in uniform, his face calm, unreadable. But his eyes, locked on Karoline, spoke with a weight that no script could bear. The coat he wore wasn't fresh or pressed. It bore the quiet scars of time, faded at the elbows, worn soft at the collar, one cuff threadbare where his hand had rested on a rifle for too many years. But it wasn't the fabric that demanded the room's attention. It was the man inside it. There was no anger in his body, no visible contempt. But he was not neutral. He was not silent in spirit. He stood like a man who had lost too much to ever raise his voice over something as trivial as ego. But who would not, under any circumstance, let his daughter stand alone? And the room reacted not with noise, but with paralysis. The audience froze. One woman near the back blinked as if snapping out of a trance, her eyes fixed on him. The host, still seated between the two women, shifted slightly, then stopped, his mouth half open, unable to form a sentence. The boom mic dropped a few inches and hovered. The teleprompter operator stopped scrolling. Someone backstage whispered into a headset, but even that went unanswered, because the truth of what was happening didn't need direction. It didn't need framing. It was the moment. Every camera in the room knew it. Without a cue, the primary lens pushed in, slow, reverent, capturing Crockett's figure not as a spectacle, but as gravity. Every shot before now had been calibrated for drama. This was something else entirely. This was reality asserting itself in a space built to contain performance. Karoline's gaze rose to meet his, and faltered. Only for a second. But it was there. She had spoken so easily just moments earlier, confident, controlled. Now her hands tightened slightly in her lap, the smile long gone, her shoulders drawing in as if realizing, all too late, that this wasn't a debate. This wasn't banter. She wasn't sparring with Jasmine anymore. She was standing inside the full, unrelenting gaze of a man who had outlived bullets, betrayal, and bureaucracy, and who was now silently asking her a single, unforgiving question. Do you still think this is just a joke? And still, he said nothing, because he didn't have to. Every inch of his body told the truth louder than any voice could carry, that there is a cost to casual cruelty, and sometimes the one paying it is sitting just a few feet from the lights. That some men have given their lives for this country in ways that cannot be captured in news cycles or applause breaks. That some battles are not fought with rifles, but with presence. Karoline's words, once sharp, now hung in the air, like fragments of something broken. Not debated, not dismantled, unraveled. Not because someone shouted them down, but because the person they tried to erase had stood up, silently, and taken back the space they were meant to occupy. And the entire room, audience, cameras, crew, felt it. No applause, no commentary. Only the long, breathless realization that truth had entered the room, and it did not need a microphone to be heard. And as the cameras slowly pulled back from the man who had stood without a word, Jasmine leaned forward, not to retaliate, but to remind the room what silence had been carrying all along. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her posture. But when she spoke, the air in the room thickened again, not with outrage, but with something heavier. Jasmine's tone was composed, almost quiet, but every word was chosen with surgical precision. When someone laughs after saying, "It was just a joke," she began slowly, They forget there are people who've been hearing that line since the day they learned how to speak. There was no anger in her voice, only history. It's said as a way to excuse what can't be explained, to dress up something ugly and something playful, but the people who laugh the hardest are always the ones who've never had to live with the aftermath of that punchline. The room had already stilled, but now it leaned in. You laugh and the world moves on. But for some of us, she continued, that joke doesn't end with a chuckle. It lingers. It carves itself into job interviews, into hospital waiting rooms, into the way we're followed around in department stores. She didn't blink. And into the way my father was treated when he came home in full uniform, bronze star on his chest, and was still told the neighborhood he tried to move into wasn't ready for that kind of change. A ripple of unease moved through the audience. Not disbelief, recognition. My father, she said, nodding subtly toward the third row, served this country longer than I've been alive. And when he returned from Kandahar bleeding from a chest wound, they thanked him with a rejection letter from a realtor who said the house had just gone under contract. Her tone stayed level, but her jaw tensed. Except it hadn't. The sign stayed up for weeks. They just didn't want him living there. Because even in a uniform with a purple heart, he was still too black to be a neighbor. No one interrupted. No one dared. And it didn't stop there, she continued, her hands now resting lightly on the edge of the table. He was asked to leave a church 2 years later. A church, mid-sermon, not for disrupting the service, not for anything he did, but because a white couple complained that his presence made them feel uncomfortable. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight of the moment pushed deeper into the studio. They said it was a misunderstanding, told him it wasn't personal, that they were just trying to preserve the unity of the congregation. You know what that means when you've heard it long enough. The lights above didn't move, but the shadows around Karoline seemed to deepen. Her fingers shifted. Once, then again. A small twitch. A breath pulled slightly too fast. Her shoulders, once straight, began to fold inward. Not dramatically, but enough to feel. She wasn't looking at Jasmine now. She was looking at her own hands, at the smooth surface of the desk. Anywhere but forward. Anywhere but at the man sitting just 3 rows away, whose life she had reduced to background context a few moments earlier. And the first time he brought me here, right here, to this building, Jasmine continued, her eyes scanning the air just above the cameras. He was stopped at the entrance, 3 times. Her voice lowered slightly, not from exhaustion, but control. He had credentials, a visitor badge. He was in a blazer and tie. But the security guard said, and I quote, "You don't look like you're related to a congresswoman." Jasmine paused. He didn't yell, didn't argue, just showed his ID again, and stood there in silence while they called a supervisor. The silence in the room wasn't just thick, it was dense now, pressing in around every corner of the studio like a sealed vault. That's what happens when a joke becomes culture, she said. It stops being funny, and it starts becoming invisible. Because it wears a suit, it carries a smile, it gets delivered in panel discussions and campaign ads and news segments with polite language and just enough sarcasm to get a laugh before it lands. Her eyes moved toward Karoline, not to confront, but to confirm. You say, "Just kidding," and the world lets it go. But my father had to walk through that world, unarmed, every time someone did. Karoline's face had lost all trace of ease. The confident tilt of her head, the crisp posture, the tactical smirk, all gone. What remained was something stripped, raw. Her hand, once holding a pen, was now closed loosely, thumb twitching just slightly against her ring finger. Her gaze never met Jasmine's. It stayed on the table, locked in a kind of inward panic, the kind that comes when you realize you've touched something sacred, and too late, you've realized your hands weren't clean. But Jasmine didn't press the advantage. She didn't lean in, didn't shift tone, didn't savor the silence she had created. She didn't need to, because this wasn't retribution. It wasn't punishment. It was testimony. And the studio had become a courtroom. Not one with walls or judges, but one built on memory, on pain, on all the things this country hides behind decorum and calls progress. Jasmine wasn't trying to win an argument. She was trying to say what had gone unsaid in rooms like this for far too long. And the most powerful part? She was still calm. The silence held like a drawn breath. And then, just as quietly as he had risen, Lieutenant Colonel Crockett sat back down. He didn't sigh. He didn't shift his shoulders or adjust his coat. He simply lowered himself into the seat with the same composure he had stood with, like he was settling into a position he had earned the right to return to. It wasn't submission. It wasn't closure. It was finality, the act of a man who had said everything he needed to say by not saying a single word. The studio felt it immediately, like a string had been plucked inside every chest, low and vibrating, impossible to ignore. The way he folded his hands again on his lap, the way he didn't even glance toward the cameras, the way his body settled without tension. It told everyone watching that what needed to be done had been done, and it had not been for applause. Across the table, Karoline froze. For a moment, it seemed like she might recover, like her well-trained instincts would pull her through. Her lips parted, her shoulders lifted as if to speak, but no words came. The line she had been holding, the rhythm she had so easily danced through earlier, was gone. There was no thread left to follow, nothing clever to reach for. She looked down at the glass table in front of her, eyes darting from her hand to the cue card, then back again, as if somewhere in the reflection she might find a script to hide behind. But the reflection didn't help her now. It showed her what everyone else already saw, that whatever power she thought she had held in this room had slipped from her grasp. Her breath caught, just slightly. It wasn't a gasp, but it wasn't steady either. Her chest rose and fell faster now. Not enough for drama, just enough for truth. She blinked again. Her fingers, once calmly intertwined, now tapped once, twice on the table edge before curling back into her lap. She wasn't under attack. No one had raised a voice, but that's what made it worse. She wasn't being silenced. She was being seen. And suddenly, she didn't know how to carry that visibility. The host, who had been silent far too long, leaned toward his mic, not with the practiced confidence he'd worn at the start of the program, but with a kind of stunned humility. His voice, when it came, cracked slightly under the weight of what had just unfolded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, more breath than voice, "I think we all need to admit something." He paused, blinked, looked out toward the camera, not for performance, but for accountability. "This is no longer a talk show." Silence. Then he said it. "This is testimony." The words fell like iron into water, slow, deep, irreversible. A few in the crowd nodded. Others sat motionless, eyes forward, hands clasped, and then someone clapped. Once, softly, almost uncertain, not in praise, not in protest, but in acknowledgement, like someone realizing they had just witnessed something they could never unsee. Another clap followed, then another, never loud, never rising into standing ovation, but real, a sound not of celebration, but of reckoning. Karoline didn't look up. She remained still, her hands folded now tightly together, thumbs pressing into each other like a nervous metronome. Her posture had shrunk, not in height, but in confidence. She had faced interviews, debates, panels. She had sparred with politicians, dismantled journalists, walked into hostile rooms and walked out with applause. But not like this. Not against silence. Not against history. Not against a father's gaze and a daughter's truth. The applause wasn't for Jasmine either. It wasn't applause at all, really. It was a sound made by people who didn't know what else to do. A sound that said, "We were here. We heard it. We know it matters." No camera angle could spin that. No post-production could soften it. What had just happened in the room would not become content. It had already become consequence. Lieutenant Colonel Crockett didn't move again. He sat exactly as he had before, hands resting over one knee, back straight, shoulders relaxed. But his stillness was no longer background. It was the room's new axis. People didn't look at him the way they had when the broadcast began. There was no curiosity now, no formality. There was only respect, and the quiet discomfort that came when you realize you may have spent years applauding the wrong people. The host cleared his throat again. "I don't know what else to say," he admitted, and for once that was the right thing to say. Caroline's breathing was audible now, just slightly. Her chest lifted again and again in uneven intervals. She was still trying to find footing, an exit ramp, a sentence, something to reclaim the space she once owned. But there was nothing to reach for. Her message had collapsed in silence. Her presence no longer shaped the room. It was shrinking within it. And the longer she sat there without speaking, the more people realized that the most dangerous thing she had said tonight wasn't her joke. It was how easily she said it. Jasmine remained composed. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She didn't lean into her opponent's unraveling. She just sat there, present, as if her job had never been to win, but simply to tell the truth and stay standing. And she had done both. Karoline glanced up just once and met Jasmine's eyes for a fleeting second. What passed between them wasn't confrontation. It was something quieter, more painful. The realization that not all silence means surrender, and not all words protect you from the consequences of using them carelessly. The audience wasn't cheering. No one was moved to standing ovation. But something had shifted, something that no one could put back. The applause stopped, not with a cue, but like a candle going out. People lowered their hands, not because they were finished listening, but because they'd heard enough to know the rest was up to them. And in the far corner, an assistant producer, barely out of college, whispered into her headset, "We're off script." There was no reply in her earpiece, because everyone already knew. They weren't just off script. They were finally fully out of denial. What happened in the studio didn't end when the cameras cut. It began quietly in the breath that followed. The clip was only 38 seconds long. No music, no dramatic zooms, no talking heads. Just a still frame of a man standing in a studio while the world finally sat still. It wasn't the kind of video designed to go viral. There were no trending catchphrases, no shout fests, no explosive walk-offs. But what it captured, a man rising without anger, without a word, just presence, cut through the noise like a whisper in a room full of shouting. No caption was needed. People shared it with a sentence, sometimes not even a sentence, just a feeling. This. And from that single moment, a wave began to rise. Slow, quiet, unstoppable. It didn't go viral because of politics. It went viral because of truth. What people saw was more than a father. They saw the cost of being silent for too long, and what it meant to finally be seen. The hashtag appeared within the first hour. Number the veteran stood. First, it was small accounts, teachers, veterans, young activists with 20 followers and tired hearts. Then it began showing up in the timelines of people who usually never noticed hearings like these. A black high school principal in Philadelphia tweeted, "He stood, and I couldn't sit still for the rest of the day." In Oakland, a grocery store clerk wrote, "My father was stopped at the Capitol too, but he never said anything. Today I watched someone say it for him without speaking." Within hours, the clip had traveled into places that didn't usually host conversations about hearings or injustice. It was showing up in Zoom classrooms, church newsletters, law firm group chats. It wasn't labeled as entertainment. It wasn't packaged as outrage. It didn't need commentary to explain what had just happened. Everyone already knew. It wasn't the drama. It wasn't the political clash. It was that one still image. A man in a worn military coat, weathered face calm, eyes fixed on a woman who had just reduced his daughter's worth to a punchline. A social studies teacher in Kansas City projected the clip onto the wall of her 10th grade classroom. Her students, normally half distracted, didn't look away. When the clip ended, no one reached for their phones. One student, a quiet boy in the back with a hoodie pulled low over his eyes, whispered, "He didn't even have to say anything, and you could feel it." Later that afternoon, the teacher tweeted, "First time all year my class sat through a clip in total silence. They didn't have questions. They understood." The tweet went viral. Not because it was shocking, but because it was too familiar to ignore. And still, the video spread. But not like wildfire. Like truth, smoldering, persistent, undeniable. One post from a retired Army medic read, "I stood too fast and started crying. Didn't know I needed that." A young college student from Detroit wrote, "My dad stood the same way when our landlord lost our lease. I'd forgotten what it looked like until now. A pastor in Alabama posted, "He stood for every man who buried his dignity so his kids could rise." And over again, different words, same idea. He stood, and something inside me stood too. What stunned people most wasn't the volume of the moment, it was its restraint. There was no rage in that video, no retaliation, just clarity. A father standing, not to accuse, not to humiliate, but to bear witness. And somehow, that was what cut the deepest. It wasn't that Karoline had been defeated, it was that her certainty had been hollowed out by the sheer, unspoken weight of what she had tried to dismiss. People weren't cheering because Jasmine had landed a comeback. They were reflecting because they had just seen someone absorb decades of insult and choose to say nothing, because he didn't have to. For many who watched, it wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. Not everyone saw themselves in it, but everyone saw something they hadn't been willing to name. The cost of silence, the power of presence, the loneliness of dignity in rooms that reward cruelty. And in thousands of comments, from veterans, teachers, single mothers, retired judges, and students alike, the same quiet theme repeated. That clip wasn't about who won, it was about who carried the weight, and they all knew who that was. It was the man who stood, without applause, and the world that could no longer pretend they didn't see him. The clip had ended, the studio lights had dimmed, and no one shouted her name. But Karoline still heard it echo every time she tried to speak. Karoline Leavitt wasn't destroyed. No headlines called for her resignation. No angry op-eds flooded the airwaves. She didn't become a trending cautionary tale or the center of a cancellation storm, but something quieter, and perhaps more permanent, unfolded in the days that followed. She canceled her schedule, not under pressure, by choice. The town halls, the live panels, the network hits that had once been lifeblood to her career suddenly felt like terrain she no longer recognized. She didn't disappear. She just stopped moving. As if she had been walking on firm ground and suddenly realized it had all been ice. And when it cracked, it hadn't sent her plunging. It had just left her standing there, unable to take another step. The silence was not punishment. It was reflection enforced by truth. Her team scrambled. Communication staff offered a dozen strategies: pause briefly and pivot, release a carefully worded statement, deflect, redirect, rebuild. One suggested she go on the offensive, call the whole thing overblown, part of another narrative war. But Karoline shook her head. She said no, not yet. Not like that. It wasn't guilt that kept her quiet. It was a different weight, something unfamiliar, something heavier than public backlash. The moment when your own words turn around and stare back at you, and you have to decide whether to look away. For 5 full days, her calendar stayed blank. She didn't tweet, didn't answer calls, didn't take interviews. She sat in her townhouse, blinds half drawn, replaying the footage. Not the whole hearing, just the moment. That moment, 38 seconds, his silence, his presence, her voice just before it, her own laughter. She listened to it not as a politician, not as a debater, but as a human being who had just, for the first time, spoken a sentence into a room and heard it fall apart in real time. The voices she usually relied on, her advisors, her consultants, even the mentors she'd long held as sacred, sounded distant now. They offered advice wrapped in procedure, but none of them had been in that studio. None of them had stood across from a father who had carried men through war zones and still had to watch his daughter be asked to carry dignity alone. And so, on the 6th day, Karoline made a choice no one predicted. She reached out to a small, independent podcast. No cameras, no studio audience. Just a quiet mic in a dim recording space hosted by journalist Lena Durham, known more for her integrity than her viewership numbers. Lena didn't tease the episode, no dramatic promos. Just a line on social: tomorrow's guest, someone ready to stop spinning and start listening. When the episode dropped, it wasn't an apology tour. Karoline didn't arrive with talking points. Her voice from the first second sounded smaller, not weak, but exposed, like someone who'd finally learned how little protection credentials can offer when truth enters the room. I've been asked to say a lot of things this week, she began, and I've written all of them down, but none of them felt right, because the only thing that felt real was the part I wasn't ready to say until now. She paused. Then, I wish I had known that I wasn't just talking to Jasmine Crockett. I was speaking into a room where a man who had once carried an entire battalion on his back was watching me reduce his daughter to a punchline. There was no music under her voice, no edits, just breathe, words, silence. That's what I didn't understand, she continued. I wasn't just wrong, I was reckless, and I didn't even know it. I thought I was being sharp, but I wasn't cutting through an argument. I was cutting through a memory I didn't own, a pain I've never lived, a silence I didn't even notice I was interrupting. She spoke in long pauses, not for effect, but because she had to fight for every word. I watched that clip later. Everyone's talking about when he stood, but what stays with me is when he sat back down. That moment wrecked me, because he didn't need to say anything. His silence was louder than anything I've said in the past 10 years. The host let her speak. No interruptions, no redirect. Karoline kept going. I've always prided myself on staying composed, but when he looked at me, without judgment, without emotion, just looked, it felt like he was asking a question I didn't know how to answer. And I think the question was, do you even understand what you're saying? She cleared her throat but didn't hide the emotion in it. I didn't, she said, and now I do. Not fully, not completely. I don't think I ever will. But I know enough now to understand that I have spoken too many times without asking who might be sitting in the third row. Lena finally spoke. What do you want people to take away from this? Karoline exhaled. Not that I'm sorry. That's too easy. I don't want this to be about me looking regretful. I want people to understand what happens when you walk into a room thinking you're the smartest voice in it and then realize, too late, that someone in that room has carried more silence than you've ever carried certainty. There was a pause, a long one. She closed with this. Some lessons don't come with applause. Some come with the sound of someone choosing not to respond to you because you haven't earned the right to be answered. And that was it. No follow-up statements, no press release. The podcast ended with a fade to silence. Not a brand reset, not a reputation rescue, just a woman sitting with what she said and the man who made sure she would never say it that way again. And while Karoline's voice drifted into the quiet corners of a podcast, Jasmine spoke just once, without saying a word. The photo appeared without fanfare. No announcement, no teaser, no statement. Just an image, square-framed, posted from Jasmine Crockett's official account at 6:12 a.m., before most of Washington had even checked the headlines. It wasn't a selfie. It wasn't a call to action. It was her father, Lieutenant Colonel Isaiah Crockett, standing alone beneath an American flag, its cloth pulled taut by the morning wind, its shadow slicing down the wall behind him like a second spine. He wasn't saluting. He wasn't facing the camera. His back was straight, his hands behind him, his gaze fixed upward at the flag he had once defended in silence. No uniform, no medals. Just a quiet gray suit and a posture the country could no longer pretend to ignore. The caption was only 12 words long, but it detonated across the internet like a truth too long unspoken. He didn't need to speak, because he already sacrificed so others could. No hashtags, no emojis, no links, just that. The image spread instantly, but not the way political posts usually do. It didn't provoke outrage. It didn't trigger arguments. It stopped people. It made them freeze mid-scroll, mid-sentence, mid-breath. It was the kind of image that didn't ask for interpretation. It commanded stillness. You didn't just view it. You stood in front of it, as if the silence of the man in the frame extended through the screen and held you where you were. The background was nothing more than a sunlit wall and the lower edge of a government building's western wing. But in that image, it looked like the edge of a country's conscience. The angle was low, deliberate maybe. It made the flag loom larger and made the man beneath it seem not small, but steadfast. He wasn't dwarfed by the flag. He was anchoring it, as if to remind everyone that its fabric meant nothing without the weight of those who had been asked to carry it without question and without thanks. Within an hour, the image had been reposted over 100,000 times. Veterans reposted it without commentary, just saluting emojis or the simple line, "We know." Civil rights attorneys reposted it with one-word captions, "Respect," "Silence," "Truth." School teachers printed it out and taped it beside chalkboards. One community college in Baltimore projected it on a hallway screen beneath a quote by James Baldwin. "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time." But there was no rage in this image, only endurance. One high school teacher in South Carolina posted it during her third period U.S. history class. Her students watched in silence. No lecture, no explanation. One student raised his hand and asked, "Did he say anything after she insulted him?" The teacher shook her head. "No," she said. "He stood. That was enough." The class didn't move for a full minute. It was the first time they didn't ask for extra credit. They asked for a copy of the photo. The captions stayed pinned at the top of Jasmine's account for 3 days. No follow-up, no clarification. And that made it stronger. Because the silence around the image wasn't absence, it was architecture. It was what allowed the truth to expand inside people's chests, uncomfortable but necessary, like a memory suddenly returned to its rightful place. People weren't praising Jasmine for her words. They were thanking her for stepping aside and letting his story breathe. Reporters reached out. Editorial boards scrambled to write think pieces. Cable networks ran the image with scrolling captions. Silence that shook Washington. But every attempt to spin the moment, every interview request, every offer to go deeper, felt hollow. Because the image already said everything. He had stood without rage. He had looked without accusation. He had sat down not to retreat, but to finish a sentence that didn't need punctuation. And now, under the shadow of the flag he had once sworn to defend, the country had finally seen him. Not as a token, not as a backdrop, but as a witness. The man who had once walked through war zones returned home to be questioned at his daughter's hearing, and chose not to speak, because he knew the truth only lands when the world is forced to fall quiet. And Jasmine, knowing that, stepped aside and let that silence become a headline. The image of her father beneath the flag lingered in silence. But the world had already begun responding, not with noise, but with invitation. They didn't come for a soundbite. They didn't come for debate. One by one, universities across the country reached out to Jasmine, not to provoke, not to perform, but to understand. What they had witnessed inside that courtroom-turned studio wasn't just restraint, it was control under fire. And students, many of them exhausted by rhetoric and spectacle, recognized something ancient in her silence. Discipline that didn't demand attention, but refused to disappear. The first event wasn't even publicized. It took place in the basement lecture hall of a Jesuit college in Maryland. 60 seats, everyone filled. The flyer didn't say Representative Jasmine Crockett. It read simply, "Holding the line, a conversation on presence." No live stream, no media credentials, just a single standing mic in the center aisle. Jasmine walked in alone. No entourage, no staffer whispering updates. She wore a gray coat, a plain notebook tucked under one arm. And when she took the mic, she looked not at the back of the room, but directly at the students in the first row. The ones who had been told their silence wasn't strategy, only weakness. She didn't open with a defense. She opened with a memory. "I was taught that the loudest person in the room usually knows the least about what it costs to listen," she said. "So when I sat there, and I heard her words, and I felt the weight of the room shift, I didn't think about my platform. I thought about my father. I thought about how many rooms he had sat in, silent, while someone said something they knew he couldn't answer without being called angry." The students didn't clap. They just listened, still, eyes fixed, because they hadn't come for applause. They came to learn how to carry silence and not collapse under it. At Columbia, the room was larger, but no less quiet. A law professor introduced Jasmine by saying, "We invite speakers here to teach constitutional strategy, but tonight we're here to study emotional intelligence under duress." She took the podium without slides, no charts, no prepared speech. She placed a single image on the screen behind her, her father standing beneath the flag, just like in her post. The room held its breath. For a full 10 seconds, she didn't say a word. Then slowly, this is what courage looks like when it's tired of proving itself. She didn't name Karoline once. She didn't need to. That part of the memory was already fading for most people anyway. Ask 1,000 students what Karoline had said, and 90% couldn't tell you. But ask them what they remember about the moment, and they would say this. The way the air in the room froze when her father stood up. The way he didn't flinch, didn't smirk, didn't even move his hands. Just rose, as if history had stood with him. At one university in Minnesota, a student asked her, "How did you not respond? How did you stay still?" Jasmine paused, then answered, "Because there's a difference between silence that protects power and silence that exposes it. Mine wasn't retreat, it was clarity. I didn't need to swing. My father was already standing. And sometimes that's the loudest thing you can do." The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. What Jasmine brought into those rooms wasn't energy, it was weight, the weight of memory. Of every time someone like her had to smile through insult. The weight of knowing that justice often demands not more rage, but more patience than most people realize is survivable. Students began to share the experience online, but not with viral quotes or flashy edits. They shared screenshots of the flag, of her father's stillness, of Jasmine standing behind a lectern in front of empty chalkboards, saying more in the pauses than most politicians say in a campaign cycle. One post read, "She didn't give us a master class in debating. She gave us a master class in surviving it." In one auditorium in Chicago, an African-American freshman stood during the Q&A, tears in his eyes. He didn't ask a question. He just said, "My dad doesn't talk about what he went through. But when your father stood up that day, I finally understood what he's been carrying." Jasmine didn't cry. She nodded, not for show, but as one witness to another. That's what the nation had begun to understand. It was no longer about Karoline. Her words, rehearsed and televised, had scattered like leaves in a storm. No one was quoting the jab anymore. No one cared whether it had been intended as sarcasm or offense, because history doesn't remember punchlines. It remembers who stood. It remembers how. What lasted, what students, professors, and even former skeptics couldn't forget, was the man who rose without anger, and the daughter who let the room sit with his silence until it couldn't bear to look away. In that stillness, generations of injustice had made themselves visible, without shouting, without retaliation, just presence. And Jasmine had carried it, not by shouting over someone else, but by refusing to let the moment pass unmarked. Not one campus invited her to teach them how to win arguments. They invited her to teach them how to withstand them. And across every stage in every room filled with future judges, senators, and school teachers, Jasmine taught only one thing: that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do in the face of insult is to let silence speak for those who were never given the mic. And that kind of silence, it never fades. And as the students left in silence, carrying fragments of a presence they couldn't explain, one truth remained. This was never just a political moment. It was a human one. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It didn't arrive at the end of a passionate speech or a moment of triumph. It came in the quiet, in the seconds after Jasmine stepped off the stage, in the breath she took before she spoke, in the photo of her father standing beneath a flag he had once defended and been denied by. The lesson was not about politics, it was about memory, about the weight we carry when the world insists we have nothing to prove, yet still demands that we justify our existence every time we enter the room. It was about how easily a lifetime of sacrifice can be erased with a joke, and how sometimes the most powerful resistance is to refuse to answer insult with noise. Jasmine never called for pity. She didn't list the wrongs. She simply let them exist in the space, unedited and intact. Her father being denied a home after war, being asked for ID at the Capitol he bled to protect, being told again and again that his silence was safer than his truth. And still he stood, not to interrupt, not to scold, but to remind the room and the nation that dignity doesn't beg to be seen. It shows up, stands tall, and waits for someone to finally notice. That was the lesson, not the pain itself, but how it was carried, without spectacle, without retaliation, without surrender. The injustice was sharp and present. It wasn't buried in history. It sat in the audience in a faded military coat. It lived in the way Jasmine's voice stayed level while her skin was politicized. It breathed in the pause between Karoline's joke and Jasmine's silence. And the lesson it taught was cruelly simple. Those who endure the most are often asked to prove it the least convincingly. But Jasmine didn't teach them to be angry. She taught them to hold, to wait, to let the silence wrap around the moment like a fuse. Because sometimes you don't need to explode. You need to make the room sit in what it just heard. And that restraint, that impossible, deliberate restraint, is where justice starts. People had expected her to strike back, to bury Karoline with brilliance, to win the moment with fire. But she didn't want to win. She wanted people to remember, not her words, but his presence. Because in the end, that's what outlasted the noise. People forgot what was said, but they never forgot who stood. And that is the brutal, human lesson no one could deny. In a world obsessed with speaking, Jasmine showed what it means to choose silence, not out of fear, but out of purpose. Out of generational knowledge that sometimes your very existence is loud enough. Out of a lifetime of watching people who look like her father be denied everything, yet still salute the flag that forgot them. What did we learn? That grace under fire is not weakness. It is strategy. That silence is not surrender. It is calculation. That the people with the most to say are often the ones who sit back and watch what the room does without their help. And maybe the most sobering lesson of all, when someone says, "It's just a joke," ask yourself, who had to survive that joke for 50 years straight just to sit in that chair? That's the man Jasmine was raised by. And that's the lesson she taught a nation that only listens once it's forced to. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.